Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Shoshana Bryant, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. Thank you for joining us today. A day that is, as Charles Dickens said, probably the best of times and the worst of times. The best of times list, of course, includes the release of all the living Israeli hostages, restored to their families, restored to life, as former hostage Eli Sharabi said. There can be nothing but gratitude to President Trump and American diplomats, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the leaders of a variety of countries who worked to make this happen. In my view, President Trump does not need a Nobel Peace Prize. Anyway, who wants to sit in the same company as Yasser Arafat? But he knows what he did, and we know what he did. Now, on the worst list, in the same vein, is the lie that Hamas told about returning the bodies of the deceased hostages. Their families need closure, and they need the dignified burial of their members for this part of the saga to end. And the saga is not ending because on the worst list as well is the reemergence of Hamas and its terrorist form executing people in the streets of Gaza. Israel is not in a position to help them. The U.S. is not in a position to help the people, and the people of Gaza have a pretty bleak future. But also on the best list are the Abraham Accords countries. There were those people, and I admit that I was among them at some points, who thought the Accords wouldn't survive the 2-year war. Now, not only did they survive the war, they appear to be going strong. So our guest today is David Schenker of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's going to talk to us about the region and how the Accords made it through the war and how things look going forward. But first, I know you've missed your JPC commercial. We are a nonprofit organization founded in 1985, providing analysis of foreign and domestic policy by scholars, academics, and commentators. Most important right now, we support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. This has been my line since October 7th. We support the efforts of the government of Israel and the IDF to defend the people of Israel in all of their borders, and when necessary, beyond those borders. And we're still supporting justice in Gaza. That has meant the release of the living hostages. I'll keep saying it, because it also means the release of the deceased hostages, the continued decimation of Hamas, and some semblance of peace with those Palestinians who see that the future includes Israel. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of the domestic center, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, and energy security, as well as free speech and intellectual diversity. You can find us on our website, jewishpolicycenter.org. You can sign up for our Insight columns, read our magazine, In Focus. The fall issue of In Focus is out. It is called Identities, Borders, and Conflict. And if you've missed our webinars, they are posted. You can find them there and binge watch. Today, I am thrilled to have David Schenker, Senior Fellow and Director of the Program on Arab Politics at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. David's a longtime analyst, but he took a hiatus from the Institute during the first Trump administration, where he was Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs and Principal Middle East Advisor to the Secretary of State. They were overseeing the conduct of U.S. policy and diplomacy in a region that consists of 18 very different countries, stretching from Morocco to Iran to Yemen. David worked on human rights policy, deterring terrorism, fighting corruption, and pushing back against America's regional adversaries. He worked to heal the Gulf Rift between Qatar and the neighboring states, and we are going to talk about Qatar today, to resolve the conflicts in Libya and Yemen, and to consolidate the Abraham Accords. It was his second stint in government, having previously served in the Pentagon in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. His writings about Jordan and Lebanon and Hezbollah and Egypt and Saudi Arabia. We've had him on for Saudi Arabia before, and it's a great webinar to go back and look at. His writing has appeared everywhere you think it should, and we are pleased to have him here with us today before he gets on a plane and leaves for Egypt. So, David Schenker, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Shoshana. It's good to be with you again. So it's been, as we talked about, as you mentioned, a pretty bleak 2 years, but really, a remarkable week. We've had, during the course of those 2 years, I think some high points, some points of joy. The day of the pager operation, the day we learned of Hassan Nasrallah's passing, the Assad regime in Syria falling. Really, some brief moments of joy and hope. But really, the ceasefire is, I think, a remarkable development. Made possible, I think, in large part because of the targeting of Hamas leadership by Israel in Doha, which actually brought together many Arab states um, and other Islamic states, in particular Pakistan, Indonesia, and Turkey. And together they reached some sort of consensus in this 20 that led to the 20-point plan where Arab and Islamic states pledged to Trump to get some skin in the game, whether in reconstruction or a post-war role in Gaza, in particular in these international stabilization force that has been promised. I think when most of us look at that, we think that this is going to be Egypt, Jordan, and the Emirates participating with boots on the ground. I'm not sure that's how it's going to look. It may be other states like Indonesia, even potentially Pakistan. Um, uh, Rules of engagement have to be defined. Command and control. So many open questions about this. What we basically do know, however, is that it's not going to be Turkey and it's not going to be Qatar with boots on the ground in Gaza. But there will be an Arab role. But as you said, when we're talking about bright spots, one of the bright spots is that, contrary to much of the conventional wisdom out there, the Abraham Accords held. Israel's partnership and peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan held, with Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates held, with Morocco held. Of course, if we trust conventional wisdom, the conventional wisdom of back in 2020 or so was that there would be a third intifada when the Trump administration moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. So can never really trust the conventional weapon, but conventional wisdom. But the Abraham Accords held. Now, that's not to say that it wasn't without stresses. Jordan withdrew their ambassador almost immediately. There hasn't been an Israeli embassy has been closed in Amman since the very beginning of post October 7th. Things got pretty bad. I mean, traditionally in Jordan, you have the foreign minister, Ayman Safadi, who is the heavy, talking about settlements, condemning Israel and international fora. More recently, it's been the king. This has been a traditional division of labor where the king doesn't really talk about Israel. But lately, the king's been on the record questioning Israel's commitment to peace, and saying all sorts of things about the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Egypt too. I think the relationship has been incredibly stressed. You saw most recently at the Arab Islamic Summit, in the aftermath of the Doha strike. You saw President Sisi of Egypt, who at one point had the best relationship with Israel of any government of Egypt, right? Based in large part on tactical and strategic cooperation fighting ISIS in the Sinai, where Israel actually flew sorties. The Israeli Air Force flew over the Sinai to target terrorist cells in support of Egyptian ground operations in the Sinai. The relationship was great. And yet, for the first time since the signing of Camp David. Just weeks ago, President Sisi, in a speech before the summit, referred to Israel as the enemy. Even Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood, the briefly tenured Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt, never referred to Israel as the enemy. This is shocking. And of course, I think, this is a little bit more serious than it might be, only in large part because the Israelis have allowed, since 2013, Egypt to flood the Sinai with tens of thousands of soldiers and hundreds of tanks, to ostensibly to defeat the Islamist insurgency in the Sinai. But more recently, they're stationed along the border of Rafah in Gaza. So this is an interesting and unfortunate development. And then, of course, with the Emirates, the Emirates themselves even hinted perhaps that they might withdraw their ambassador from Tel Aviv. They're the only country that still has an ambassador in Tel Aviv. That they might have to withdraw their ambassador, and if Israel moved ahead with annexation of West Bank territories or other measures, that the extremely warm peace between Israel and the UAE might deteriorate to a peace that looks closer or more similar to that of Israel with Jordan and Egypt, a cold peace. So I think these relationships were stressed out, but nonetheless persisted. And we saw, actually, I think the day after the ceasefire, Israel sent a new ambassador back to Bahrain, who was, I believe, greeted by the king. And it seems like things are slowly but surely getting back on track. I think it's going to take a lot more time with Jordan and Egypt, but with the Emirates and with Bahrain, certainly, I think these countries are just pleased in many ways that the war is over. It may or may not be over. Right? We have a ceasefire, and I think both Israel and Hamas are fundamentally trying to avoid blame for the ceasefire falling apart. There are so many, I think, question marks about how we're going to move ahead with the remaining 3/4 of this 20-point Trump peace proposal. But for Trump, anyway, he said at the time in Sharm el-Sheikh, when they had the signing ceremony, he said very clearly, he said that the ceasefire was more than just an end to the war. He said, with God's help, it will be the beginning for an entire beautiful Middle East. And he also said, went on to say that countries in the region and elsewhere are standing in line to join the Abraham Accords. Now, we don't know if this is reality, if this is hyperbole, this is getting swept up in the moment. I think there are, prospects out there, but perhaps the most likely not being in the Middle East. Right? We heard the speech at the United Nations of Prabowo, of Indonesia, talking about that Israel needs security as well, not an hour-long or 15-minute-long speech condemning Israel, but actually recognizing the position and empathizing with the position that Israel is in. And there had been some earlier reports that Indonesia might announce in Sharm el-Sheikh that it would be joining the Abraham Accords. This is a sensitive issue in I think, the most populous Muslim country in the world. I believe it is. But once again, I think very forward leaning. Somaliland, although not a country, certainly has connections with Israel, and is opening, is very open to pursuing ties with Israel. A lot of talk lately and a lot of hopes that weren't realized about Syria potentially joining the Abraham Accords. I think that's, in my view, premature. This is a government, and we can talk about whatever you think of Ahmed al-Shara, reformed jihadist. I think there's many in Israel who still refer to him by his nom de guerre, Jolani. I think this guy basically came to power on the backs of foreign fighters, whether Chechen or Uyghur or from throughout the region, Jordanian, you name it, Tunisian, etc. And these foreign fighters have, obviously a very distinct view of Israel that is not positive. And what's more, I think for his rule itself is pretty tenuous, right? It's not a foregone conclusion that Ahmed al-Shara is going to succeed. There's been a number of attempts on his life. And I think it's important to note from the Syrian perspective that Israel has occupied and annexed Syrian territory, a large portion of it with the Golan. Notwithstanding the U.S. recognition, that is not an issue that is it's over for many Syrians. And so I think that there is a realistic prospect of resumption of the 1974 disengagement agreement, maybe a non-belligerency pact, a type of ongoing engagement, right? You had Shibani, the foreign minister of Syria, meet with Ron Dermer in Europe with Tom Barak, the administration's envoy. I see actually pretty realistic possibilities for moving ahead on making the relationship between Syria and Israel more normal. But I don't see a normalization agreement anytime soon. But there is something happening there. Lebanon. I have colleagues who think that Lebanon will be the next country that signs on to a normalization deal with Israel. We do have, and we did have the president of Lebanon say just the other day that Lebanon should engage in negotiations with Israel. This is a pretty big step, although it's not like Lebanon hasn't negotiated with Israel before. For decades, Israel and Israeli troops, soldiers, generals, and Lebanese generals have met under the auspices of UNIFIL, the UN Interim Force in Lebanon, on a monthly basis. When they haven't done so for a couple of years, but routinely would meet to discuss matters related to security along the Lebanese-Israeli border. I met when I was Assistant Secretary of State. I convened a negotiation, reportedly a indirect negotiation in Nakura to restart border negotiations, maritime border negotiations between Lebanon and Israel. These, continued under Ambassador DeRocher, the former U.S. ambassador to Algeria, who was managing these negotiations for a time, and later with Amos Hochstein. And so I would expect, and the president of Lebanon said this himself, that we've done this before. There's no reason not to do it. And I would expect that will move forward. Whether this results in a peace, I don't see that coming about anytime soon, although I think in Lebanon, many people are talking about it more openly these days, and I think there will be a move to end the criminalization of contacts with Israel. Perhaps that's doable, but there's a broader question here about whether this is something that President Joseph Allen views as strategic and something he's committed to, or something that would take the pressure off the president in terms of his commitment to the United States and the Lebanese people to actually disarm Hezbollah. That movement north of Litani has stalled, and there are signs that the Lebanese government is getting cold feet about doing that, or perhaps the Lebanese armed forces. They really fear a civil war. So that's another, issue entirely. But I think that's in the realm of negotiations, some degree of some connection or ties, ongoing discussions with Israelis, either direct or indirect. That is in the positive column, although well short of normalization or Abraham Accords. Finally, and I may be missing a few here, but Saudi Arabia. This too, I think, if we look at the polling numbers, I think before October 7th, 2023, there was a lot of talk about normalization being on the horizon for Israel and Saudi Arabia. The Biden administration had been deeply engaged in talks. There was a list, essentially, of to-do items, things that Saudi Arabia wanted. And of course, as we know, typically countries that sign on to peace agreements with Israel are paid in one currency or another, right? Israel got a huge package when they signed on to peace with Egypt. Egypt got $2 billion at the time per year in military and economic funding. Jordan could have asked for anything it wanted. They asked for a squadron of F-16s. The Clinton administration in 1994 packed up the Minnesota Air National Guard, desks and all, and shipped it off to Jordan. And since then, they've gotten, hundreds of millions of dollars a year in FMF. This isn't just a gift. It serves U.S. interests as well and the stability of the kingdom. The UAE, they got MQ-9 drones and would have gotten F-35 Joint Strike Fighters. That was part of the agreement. Had they agreed to take Huawei out of their 5G networks, they refused. But I think the drones are still on the table for the Emirates and other items. Bahrain, they forgot to ask for anything. They probably should have asked to have their tariffs lifted on aluminum. They would have gotten it. They didn't ask for anything. Morocco doubled the size of its country in response to signing the Abraham Accords, or subsequent to the Abraham Accords, a normalization deal with Israel. And so what will ultimately Saudi Arabia, what was their ask? Their ask was civilian nuclear enrichment capabilities, defense agreement with the United States, a commitment to defend the kingdom in writing, whether a treaty or some other type of obligation, and then of course access to top shelf military equipment, as well as I think AI or advanced chips. But listen, I think we saw President Trump go to Saudi Arabia, have a hugely successful visit to the Gulf. I believe it was in May, and the president had basically acceded to all the requests without normalization being on the table. And I think that was, basically reading the room, which is that 2 years or so into the war in Gaza, that it was going to take some time for the Saudis to reconsider, or once again to consider, the prospect of normalization with Israel. I mean, it's an authoritarian state But at the same time, it is, I think there is a sensitivity to public opinion. And before the war, I think in 2023, 2022, the polling suggested that something like I want to say 17 or 13% of of um, of Saudis were amenable or didn't oppose normalization with Israel. I think that figure is something like 3% now. So I think it's going to take some time. And I think the president realized that it was important to move forward with the U.S. bilateral relationship with Saudi, investment opportunities, getting closer strategically, and not having that contingent on a normalization that was going to be, at best a few years away. But all the incentives were essentially delivered. At the end of the day, Saudi doesn't need any incentives, right? I think they will choose to move ahead with this when they see that the time is right. And so that for the time being, in my view, is not on the table. But there are hopes out there, and I think in the aftermath of the war, and even if we don't get to the 20 points, right, that is the reconstruction of Gaza, and U.S. brokered negotiations with Palestinians on self-determination after the Palestinian Authority reforms. Even if we don't get to that, and have something that is less, I think that the region may be, more conducive for, I think, deep and productive engagements once again between Arab states and Israel in a way that can make more normal, if not normalize, these type of ties. So, Shoshana, there's a lot more to talk about, but I think I hit the heart of the matter there. Yeah.
You've hit so many things. You've opened up a very, very wide spectrum for questions, and I have questions across a wide spectrum. So let's start where you ended with, which is with Saudi Arabia. One of the things I think that surprised people was the Saudi-Pakistan agreement. And you mentioned also that Pakistan may be a country that would consider closer cooperation, or maybe even consider one day the Abraham Accords. How did Pakistan get in here? Tell us about the Saudi-Pakistani agreement.
Well, the Saudi-Pakistani agreement, I think, happened the day after the Israeli strike
Mhm.
in Doha. Obviously, this had been in the works for some time. Pakistan brings a lot to the relationship. Let's say, top on the list is nuclear weapons, right?
Yes.
Whether or not that is something that is part of the agreement. This is something that I think Saudi thinks about, not only of long term threat from Iran, to protect itself, but in Pakistan, is a state that has benefited, I think, historically from some degree of Saudi financial largesse. Um, in any event, I'm not sure that the Saudis actually brought the Pakistanis to the table on this. I think President Trump has a better relationship with Pakistan, not only for forging, or de-escalating the tensions between Pakistan and India and Kashmir, averting, nuclear war, or perhaps just de-escalating. But I think there's some indications that the relation, there's more ongoing communication with the Pakistanis. Whether the Israelis will be comfortable with this or not, open question. More comfortable than Turkey, absolutely, right? More comfortable than Qatar, yes. But this is still the Pakistanis are not fans of Israel. But you're going to need a coalition, right? And countries that are willing to do this, I think, will be considered. And it's no cakewalk, right? There may be very well a Hamas insurgency, you know, targeting their fellow Muslims or Arabs in Gaza. Um, I don't have much more to offer than that, other than to say, I think this was announced, the Pakistan Saudi deal, right after Doha, at a time when, I mean, the Arabs very clearly knew that, notwithstanding administration denials, that the administration knew well in advance that Israel was going to hit Hamas leadership in Doha. And this was, and I think, what was a significant issue for many of the Gulf states that are, allies, partners, major non-NATO allies of the United States. I think it raised all sorts of concerns, and you saw that that there was a big step by the administration in the aftermath to reassure not only Qatar but the other states. But I think this, the Pakistan deal was a direct result of what happened in Doha.
Well, I find it interesting. It strikes me the same as Indonesia, countries that we would not have thought would have any interest in playing any role here and to end up doing something. But let's stick with Saudi Arabia for a moment. At one point, the Saudis were saying they were only interested if there was a two-state solution on the table. And I think Israel has made it clear there's no two-state solution. But the Saudis have also said that they were interested in a pathway for Palestinian self-government. That certainly could be on just about anybody's table, as long as annexation wasn't on the table. It seems to me that was a bit of a ruse, because despite the fact that certain of Netanyahu's right-wing partners have talked about annexation, he's been the prime minister for a long time, never tried to annex Judea and Samaria, isn't particularly interested in it. But when President Trump said you can't do it, he had an exit ramp to say, we're not doing it. So is a lot of this kabuki theater? I know the Japanese aren't in it at all, but we can have a little kabuki here where everybody tries to pick a point. So are the Saudis wedded to two states, or are the Saudis wedded to a pathway for self-governance? Is Israel wedded to the process, or is it considering annexation? I mean, these are all moving parts.
Yeah, certainly some of the coalition partners of Netanyahu spoke about annexation quite a bit, and I think for many Arab countries, they conflate the E1 development plan, connecting Ma'ale Adumim to Jerusalem, as also being annexation, right? And so, I think there was a real concern there, particularly among the Emirates, but also the Jordanians and the Egyptians. And by the way, Trump also added, no forcible, emptying out of Gaza, and that if Palestinians voluntarily leave, that they should be allowed to return. Right? He sort of took both of these things off the table for Netanyahu. Listen, whether that makes things easier for Netanyahu with this coalition, I personally, I think the very difficult to analyze how the prime minister has balanced and will continue to balance, or bring in another party to the coalition, if this, if the 20-point plan moves forward. I think, listen, clearly coalition partners said, the E1 will prevent the possibility of a contiguous Palestinian state, right? And that's why they're trying to do it. And Netanyahu's government approved it, right? So, when President Trump has a great deal of leverage on Israel, right?
Yes.
He has been very supportive of the prime minister, and yet you've seen the leaks that have emerged, right? deliberate leaks, right? To Axios and others. Netanyahu bombs everything, he said at one point, after hitting the Ministry of Defense in Syria. Um, you know, a number of things. So I think the president, knew that he couldn't keep the Arabs on board with this proposal if he didn't say that, and perhaps this helps insulate Netanyahu within his coalition. As for where the Saudis are at, we've seen different types of statements from them. We saw a 1 point pathway, the MBS and Faisal bin Farhan, the foreign minister, talk about the so-called realistic, irreversible pathway to peace as being a prerequisite for the normalization with Israel. We've also seen the Saudis talk about statehood, right? Palestinian statehood.
Right.
We also know that for years we didn't see senior level Saudi officials mention Palestinians at all, right?
Right.
I think there's an ongoing conversation, certainly here at the Institute and elsewhere, about what the bottom line is for the Saudis. Do they mean what they say? Do they care about the Palestinians? Has the cost increased since the war in Gaza? I get the sense that it has increased a bit, but if the bar is Palestinian statehood, I think we're going to have a very hard time getting there. Whether we have some other type of self-determination, whether that irreversible path towards something, I think that's more doable. But I think these Arab states and it will and Islamic states, it'll be interesting to see one of the successes of President Trump. And whether this was deliberate or inadvertent, was to get Arab states to have skin in the game on the Palestinian issue. This is unprecedented. So, when we talk about inadvertent, right? We saw in the first Trump administration, they had the vision for peace, right? It didn't land well in the region, right? The Israelis didn't have to reject it because the Palestinians rejected it, faster. But the Israelis liked the part about annexation, and because timing didn't work out, whether it was Israeli elections, then COVID, then Pesach, then Israeli elections, then U.S. elections, it didn't work out. And so it worked out great that Israel could trade, annexation for normalization and the Abraham Accords, right? I think that was a part of that was just timing and serendipity. But they got the same. The president got the same. And sorry for going on so long here. The president got the same, Shoshana, with the Gaza Riviera plan, which also didn't land well in the region. And lo and behold, you got the Egyptians coming forward with a reconstruction plan for Gaza. Now, the plan was sorely lacking, right? It was 100 pages of grandiose plans for making Gaza the Dubai on the Med, and all this was going to be paid for by the Gulf, and Egypt was going to get all the construction contracts with its and benefit greatly. And it didn't mention the word Hamas in the proposal, and it didn't mention the word governance really, and nothing about security, and so it was lacking. But this was, I think, the first time that we actually got Arabs coming forward and actually getting skin in the game. And I think Trump built on that with this 20-point proposal to get Arab buy-in, backing, and then a role not only in reconstruction, but also in the International Stabilization Force.
So it seems that, and we as Americans see this with President Trump in many areas, he throws out a big plan and he waits to see what comes back. Somebody in the Emirates said after his Gaza Riviera plan, we're not rejecting it. We're in the solution seeking business. And if you're in the solution seeking business, you can take those big, wild plans and see what parts of them work for you. And parts of them apparently work. So let's look at a country that stands to benefit, that thinks it's going to benefit, but in fact has been a rotten player in all this, and that's Qatar. Um, they finance all kinds of bad things. They do all kinds of bad things. On the other hand, we have a military base there that the United States thinks is extremely important to us. I believe it is. Um, what do we do about them? We let them in and say it doesn't matter that you supported Hamas all these years. Now you can play with us.
All right. Well, Shoshana, but forgive me, I'm going to have an unpopular answer here.
Go ahead.
Um, Qatar funded Hamas at the request of Benjamin Netanyahu, right?
Explain why. This is important. Explain why.
Yeah, I mean, the government of Israel wanted there to be money to pay bureaucrats and do other stuff in Gaza on the belief, the mistaken belief, the groupthink that led ultimately to October 7th, that Hamas wanted to rule Gaza and that they were deterred. And all we had to do is make them, fat and get them color TVs and good cable, and they would be happy and just ruling Gaza. Um, it was wrongheaded, and it was an assessment that cost the lives of thousands of Israelis and thousands of Palestinians ultimately. But that wasn't freelancing, right? I mean, the Israelis provided the security for the Qatari who brought in the suitcases, and they escorted them into Gaza, right? So let's start there. Yes, Qatar.
Start there, and it's really important that one starts there, because I have to say we don't spend a lot of time judging what the Israeli government does, but I do think there will be a commission when this calms down, and Israel is going to have to, and I think Israel will, go back over all of those things, misconceptions, properly raised concerns, improperly raised, all the things, positive and negative, that led you to October 7th. I believe that the Israelis will have to deal with it, and they will. And clearly the role of Qatar and the Israeli government has to be one of those.
They've done this before, right? They did Winograd Commission, and these are, biting reports that talk about the failures that led to tragedies.
We could use a little of that on occasion. Wouldn't be bad.
Well, we did 9/11 report, et cetera. Yep. So listen, Qatar is a mixed bag, right? They can and traditionally have talked to parties that we didn't talk to, right? Whether it be the Taliban or Hamas. The Bush administration that I served in asked Qatar to, to provide a home for Hamas, for the leadership. They did so. It doesn't mean that, they did so perhaps in part because they wanted to be useful, perhaps in part because they love the Muslim Brotherhood. For whatever reason, they did this, and it proved helpful over the years. And Qatar has proved helpful. They go and deal with terrorists. They deal with Iran. They pay people money to get out, states money to get out American hostages. They've been very helpful in that regard. But yes, they like the Muslim Brotherhood, just like Turkey likes the Muslim Brotherhood. They share a worldview with them, and they also provide the United States with, the largest air base in the region, Al Udeid Air Force Base, where they have the CAOC, the Combined Air Operations Center, where we run all of U.S. air operations from Egypt to Afghanistan, right, out of that base. And we don't have the type of restrictions that we have with other partners, like the UAE, for example. We can do we have great operational freedom out of Udeid. So this has been a benefit to us. It's a hard thing to move. Yes, Al Jazeera, the government-funded network, that was the granddaddy of the cable, of Arab satellite TV, has traditionally been anti-American, anti-Israel, incendiary. Probably got tens and hundreds of Americans killed in Iraq through their spurious reporting. They had Al Qaeda people that have been arrested that have been journalists for Al Jazeera, Hamas, et cetera. We know um, the problems here. At the same time, once again, they've served, I think, a helpful role to us on other types of regional diplomacy, um, and um, and compared to other partners in the region, I tend to think that they hedge a little bit less with China than some of our other better friends do. So, yes, we paid them for their role in this 20-point plan. Well, we paid them. First of all, the president wrote an extraordinary executive order where he promised to protect Qatar essentially against Israel, right? President Trump issued an executive order. And the second is that we provided them with a National Guard, training facility for Qatari Air Force in Idaho, right? So they benefited from playing a positive role in bringing pressure to bear on Hamas to sign on to this ceasefire. We'll see if they continue to,
But
to bring this pressure to bear.
okay, let me ask you just because you mentioned the U.S. agreement to protect Qatar, which from Israel. I
It doesn't say Israel in there,
I know.
but
So here's my question. It seems to me that as Qatar plays a bigger role and plays it with Abraham Accords countries and plays it openly with Israel and openly with the United States, and you make a good point that Qatar is, in my opinion, it's not a great country, but it does certain useful things and needs to be dealt with that way. Is it conceivable that one of the things that Qatar worries about is not an attack from Israel, but an attack from Iran? That it slides farther from the Islamic Republic, closer to the Saudis and the Egyptians and the Emiratis and Israel. And would you have to worry then about Iran turning on you?
yeah, I mean that could, the closer they get with the Gulf, with the United States, their dealings with Israel. Um, yeah, I mean that ups the ante. I mean, but they have thought about this strategically, right? They
Mhm.
don't, they pay for the 2,300 Americans on that base in Qatar. They pay for all kinds of upgrades to the facility, et cetera, because the force protection that is provided for Udeid Air Force Base extends for the whole island
Right.
of Qatar, right? So yeah, they have an army and a navy and an air force, but you hardly need it because you have the United States there. But yeah, I think they share a natural gas field with Iran, right? So by necessity, they have more better or more productive working relationship with Iran than most in the region. Um, but yeah, that's a hazard, a potential hazard to them.
What I'm learning here, um, or what I'm having reinforced is the idea that countries are not all of one thing and countries are not all of another thing, which goes to another point that you made, and that is the Syria question. And there are plus points to having Assad out of Syria. There are minus points, perhaps, to the current government. Somebody's still killing the Druze, and that's a big problem for Israel. So if you were looking at al-Shara and you said, here's what I need from Syria to keep them, to bring them closer to this coalition of Arab countries, what does Israel and what does the United States need from al-Shara, who, by the way, was just in Russia having that conversation with Putin? What do we need?
Yeah, actually, the interesting thing about Putin, and maybe I got this wrong, but Russia had great relationship with the Assad regime, or providing the Assad family with sanctuary now. You know, for Israel, believe it or not, they'd probably prefer to have the Russians back in Syria. Because that way, if they were in certain parts of Syria, they wouldn't have to worry about Turkey being there, right? I don't subscribe to this view. Old school American foreign policy: keep the Russians out of the Middle East. They muck things up. I don't think they play a productive role wherever they're at. But what does it take? I mean, the Arabs the Gulf has embraced al-Shara, right? They're having economic investment development delegations going to Damascus looking for investment opportunities, wanted pressing the United States to drop the sanction. The Trump administration appears to be moving forward quickly with that, trying to even end the Caesar Act sanctions, to basically provide every opportunity for al-Shara to succeed, because you have a country here that's totally destroyed after 14 years of civil war, and no economic life, and 6 hours or 7 hours of electricity per day in the capital. Something has to be done about this. Listen, I think the way to do this is not to bring in necessarily force Israel and Syria closer together. I mean, these Gulf states, particularly I think Saudi and UAE, can have a very positive impact. In any event, it's not a foregone conclusion that al-Shara is going to make it, right? It's still early. The guy has shown tremendous dexterity at balancing sort of relations with all the different components of minorities and other components of Syrian society. But he's also dealing with part of his ruling coalition that he can't control and he can't discipline. And if he tries to discipline this group, they're going to kill him and could kill him. You'd want, for example, for al-Shara to say to these foreign fighters that he's going to buy them all farms and get them married and let them live at peace in Idlib and retire them. That's not possible. It's not going to happen. And so, I think the minorities and these groups are concerned. They don't want to put down their own weapons, right? Whether in Suwaida, the Druze community, the Kurds and the SDF in the east, the Alawites. There have been some regrettable incidents, but let's remember, it's so early. There's a fractured society, 60, 70 years of the Assad regime, dating back to the 70s. You had a minoritarian rule. You had, suppression of all these groups. It's going to be hard to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So I'm not sure if it's the right thing to do to lift all the sanctions without having a certain type of leverage over type of standard type of behavior, which is, okay, treatment of minorities. Do we care about that anymore? I don't know if that's an administration thing, right? We don't deal like the Trump administration. You heard President Trump in Riyadh. He said, he condemned the neocons, right? People that want to interfere in the internal matters of countries 6,000 miles away. He said, no, you guys can handle this yourselves, right?
Well, they can handle things themselves. We don't always approve of the way they choose to handle them. One could say right now, and I sort of should say, Hamas is handling its internal problems in the Gaza Strip. It's executing people in the streets. Now, should the United States jump in there with boots and stop them? No. In my opinion, please no. Is Israel going to go back there and stop Hamas from executing Gazans? I don't think so. So,
we just had Brad Cooper, and not Brad Cooper, the actor, but the head of CENTCOM, come forward and issue a statement, I think yesterday, day before, saying enough of this. It's got to stop.
okay.
So that's going to mean that he has to talk to our Arab coalition partners to tell Hamas, you can't, go around executing all these people. And if you do it, then there's going to be, as Trump would say, hell to pay.
Okay, but what does that mean? Who's going to make them pay?
Listen, Israel has a ceasefire, a highly successful ceasefire in Lebanon that has been in place since November 24.
Right.
That ceasefire, since November 24, Israel has killed about 500 Hezbollahis, right? Several targeted strikes per week, right? I imagine if Hamas is going to go slaughtering all the people of Gaza or all its rivals, or take revenge for its military setbacks in Gaza, then there may be a response, and this thing may break down. I think there will be a blame game,
Yeah.
but Hamas ultimately will be held responsible,
And
certainly by the United States.
one would hope that the Arab states will hold them responsible if they have any, it seems to me, concern about Palestinian people or the Palestinian public. They've got to hold Hamas responsible in some way, but they may be waiting for Israel to do the actual work, which would be interesting. Actually, it would bring us to a great point here, David, because I think what you've done for us over the last hour is said that nothing's clear, nothing's straight, nothing is a single line from point A to point B. Everything has, um, you know, we're knitting a sweater here. It's all intertwined.
There's
So
threats, yeah.
all threads. And that leads us to my standard closing question as we come to the end of this. And I know everybody's going to have to go back and start rethinking what we think about all the players. So I like to leave on an optimistic note. I like for our speaker to say something positive. Clearly, there are positive things happening in the region, and there are negative things happening in the region. If I asked you to balance them, on balance, are you looking forward optimistically, or are you looking forward pessimistically? Are you looking for a bed to hide under in case things go wrong? Where are we going?
Well, I can't tell where we're going, but what I can tell you is that, and I think that probably everyone shares this view. The season, even if we don't get the 20 points, right? If we get uh, the return of the bodies, if we get some significant humanitarian assistance going into Gaza, I think this is important as well. And we end up with Israel on the outskirts of Gaza with the buffer zone. And this doesn't work out, and Hamas refuses to move forward. Um, you know, it would be a shame that there will not be a rebuilding of Gaza. Um, but I think there will be a benefit to this, to have it go to a move to a different phase, right? So even if we fall short for one reason or another, I think it's positive, and we can stop the bleeding, not just the Israeli reserve soldiers going in and innocent Palestinians being hit. That Israel can do what it's doing in Lebanon, and this would not be optimal. But stopping the bleeding is also, from my view, sort of turning around this increasing isolation of Israel, not only in the region but in the world. Right, a change situation on the ground, I think, holds the potential for some healing, and so I'd say that's all on the positive column.
And I'm going to stop on that side because I don't want to hear the negative side. David Schenker, thank you for opening our eyes, broadening our view. That's exactly what I hoped you would do. So I really appreciate it. Let me wish you well on your trip to Egypt. Maybe you'll come back and tell us how it went.
Absolutely.
And great. So thank you very much. And to all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in. And we will see you again next week.